What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Redonkulous Gaming, and I'm going to do something a little bit different for Brewmasters as we introduce this video series, and I'm going to go over a number of the changes prior to dissecting each of the individual Covenant class abilities. The reason for that is that Brewmaster actually saw more changes than any other tank in Shadowlands, and it's certainly worth reviewing here. And so first I want to start out with Stagger. I mean, Stagger is essentially no more, at least in terms of the way that we know it today. Instead, what you're going to be getting are stacks of elusive brawlers, which is going to grant shuffle for 3 seconds. So they're bringing back shuffle and making it more of a stagger component. And the way that this works is, instead of it being just a button that you push that gives you 7 seconds worth of stagger, you're going to be essentially using your rotational DPS abilities, blackout kick, keg smash, spinning crane kick, and those are going to grant you shuffle for a period of time. And so you'll also notice that blackout strike no longer exists, so everything is blackout kick. They've made that so that it's normalized across all 3 of the monk specs, but essentially making sure that you are on top of casting those 3 abilities and you're rotationally sound is going to ensure that you have shuffle up, which is going to give you your stagger mechanic. If you are someone that has struggled with the Brewmaster rotation in the past and you're not necessarily getting the number of blackout kicks or keg smashes and now spinning crane kicks out that you necessarily need, you're likely going to struggle in keeping shuffle and your stagger up throughout the duration of a singular fight. So it's something to keep in mind, is that you need to be rotationally sound to execute this if you're going to go Brewmaster in Shadowlands. What I will say is that it is rather difficult to not have stagger up at this point in time. You're essentially casting blackout strike on cooldown so that you're generating your elusive brawler stuff, which is very similar to the way that it worked in live and BFA. And since it no longer is granting you elusive brawler, it's going to be granting you shuffle now instead. And as long as you keep casting that on cooldown, you're effectively looking at 100% uptime on your shuffle or your stagger there. Keg smash is only going to help. It's a longer cooldown, so it grants longer cycles of shuffle. And then spinning crane kick as needed. If there's any downtime where you're hitting multiple mobs, spinning crane kick really kind of helps keep shuffle up, and it makes it relatively easy to manage. The next thing that we're going to see in the major change that you're going to see is that Blizzard has essentially brought back the old guard mechanic. And if you're not familiar with that, what that was, is it was a flat out absorb shield that you could just kind of cast and you'd have it on demand. That was kind of old school monk tanking, and something that they kind of abandoned because it wasn't as fun and it was relatively weak. What they've introduced now is Celestial Brew, and this is something that synergizes with your Purifying Brew as well, in that you chug your Celestial Brew and it's going to grant you a absorb shield based on a multiplicative equation of your attack power times versatility, damage, so on and so forth. It's on a 1-minute cooldown, and the other thing that this interacts with is Purifying Brew. Purifying Brew is actually going to increase the absorption of your next Celestial Brew by up to 200% of the stagger that you just purified. So those things are going to go hand in hand. So since we are no longer dealing with the need to manage stagger uptime, and it is now something that is going to be more rotationally inclined, Celestial Brew has essentially replaced that and is going to give you a nice baseline absorb shield if you only use Celestial Brew. However, if you work and you build up your stagger to the point where it needs to be purified, we're talking 50% or maybe more, if you hit Purifying Brew and you purify that damage, your next Celestial Brew cast is actually going to be increased by up to 200% based on the amount of stagger that you actually purified with Purifying Brew. So the introduction of Celestial Brew, kind of the old school guard that they used to have for Brewmasters, mixed in with a little bit more synergy with your Purifying Brew, you're essentially now using your Purifying Brew to buff your Celestial Brew. So Purifying Brew is now on 2 charges, and you no longer have 3 charges baseline with a 4th as an option. You're going to have 2 charges of your Purifying Brew. This then is going to be used to interact with and buff your Celestial Brew and give you a larger absorb shield to cast on yourself. So that is the other major change that is coming to Brewmaster monks in Shadowlands. The next skill that is coming back, it's worth talking about because situationally, this is a goofy spell. It was super clunky back when it was introduced in MoP, and that is Clash. And the fact that they are bringing it back is more of a class identity skill more than anything. It was super glitchy back in the day in Shadowlands so far, just in basic testing. I haven't run into too many issues with it, so maybe they fixed it, but I have a feeling we're still going to run into some issues with Clash down the road. If you're not familiar with this ability or you're new to the Brewmaster class, what this does is it's essentially a charge where you meet the mob in the middle. You charge each other, you meet halfway in between, and then you root all targets within 6 yards for 4 seconds. So they brought that skill back, and it's worth calling this skill out specifically more for the dungeon experience because you can't necessarily clash with any target. So if I were to cast Clash on a boss, for example, the boss isn't going to move. It's just going to come at me as if it would if I had taunted it. But if you cast Clash on anything that can be like Death Gripped, for example, you'll have that target run at you, you'll meet it in the middle, and then you'll be able to root everything that's around that. So you're going to want to target this by essentially targeting the mob that's maybe in the back of the pack, that as it moves forward you have a higher chance of rooting everything else in place so you can gain control of it. I mentioned this ability mainly because, first of all, it's fun. It was a little clunky. It still feels a little awkward to play with. But the main value that I actually am getting out of Clash is that because you're forcing a mob to move, it's best used on mobs that are casters. So you can effectively get another interrupt on a caster that you normally would not have had. So if your leg sweep is down, if you're unable to interrupt, using Clash in the same way that you use Death Grip to interrupt a mob that might be a caster, or even bring it in closer to the group, that can certainly be a fun and a very good thing. So it's kind of cool to see that one come back. I hope that it doesn't run into some of the weird, awkward issues that it had back in the day, but time will tell on that one. This next one is something that's just worth mentioning. They've now made Expel Harm baseline to the entire monk class, which means ultimately what they've done for Brewmasters is they've given you a little bit more viability in terms of solo content and a little less reliance on healers. We're still probably the class that relies on our healers more so than any of the other tanks as it stands today. But Expel Harm is done in a way now that you draw in all your positive chi spheres and expel negative chi. This works as a damaging effect for the nearest enemy based on 10% of the amount healed. So you're not using it primarily as a damaging ability, you're using it more so as a heal. Now, where this can be fun from a gameplay perspective is that this is not something that you feel like you have to cast on cooldown. It's actually something that as a player you can make the decision, am I going to get more value by casting Expel Harm now and drawing in and maybe healing myself on cooldown, or is it something that I want to wait for a big hit on? Maybe I'll have more healing spheres down, and that way I can get a higher heal on myself. And just being faced with that decision between, is this something I want to include in my rotation and just kind of baseline buff my healing, or is it something that I want to plan for a big hit? I can go ahead and purify that big hit, follow it up with a large Expel Harm heal, and really kind of smooth out my health pool for my healer. That's a really good gameplay design, really good gameplay decision to make if you're going to go with a Brewmaster. So it's something that you know, the healing spheres were just not spawning often enough. Expel Harm, not necessarily baseline throughout for the entire monk class. Now that it is, it gives you a little bit more of the feeling like you're viable soloing while you're face tanking something. So Expel Harm and having that work in the way that it does now versus the way that it did in the past is actually a really good thing. So having that gameplay decision between when you're going to use Expel Harm and when you're going to get the most value out of it is really a good player choice if you're going to be tanking on a Brewmaster. Now, two more things that I do want to mention. The first of which is this: Stagger is now something that delays magic attacks in the same way that it delayed physical attacks before. So if you're familiar with the Stagger effects before, it really was strictly based on physical damage that you were taking, and that was primarily based on your agility. Now what this has done is since we no longer have to manage our Stagger and it now has become more of a rotational thing, the shuffle ability is ultimately what's going to allow you to kind of shrug off damage from all sources. So now Brewmasters are going to be a little bit more viable when it comes to magic damage as well, and that's certainly a good thing. And then the last one, I kind of glossed over it before, but I'm just going to come back to it. Purifying Brew now has 2 charges instead of the baseline 3 that you're seeing in live today. And that change is so that it synergizes better with Celestial Brew. You're really only going to be purifying for the sake of boosting your Celestial Brew or when things get out of control. The cooldown for Purifying Brew and Celestial Brew still synergizes real well with Keg Smash and Tiger Palm. You're going to be able to decrease the cooldown of both of those abilities by just executing your rotation as you normally would. So those 2 changes are really the last shout outs that I would like to call. And then the last one that I had that is a net new skill and is now baseline is that every monk spec has their own Celestial that they're able to summon, and they all do different things. So, you know, we're getting Dave back is really what I'm saying. And Dave, if you're not familiar, is our Ox buddy, and he's gonna come in and he's gonna essentially do a little bit of AoE. He doesn't hit overly hard right now. The spell is called Invoke Nuazu, the Black Ox, and this is where you're gonna have him hang around for 25 seconds, and he's gonna attack your primary target. He'll also stomp and damage enemies for, I think it's like 16% of your attack power, and then while he's active, he's also going to take 25% of the damage delayed by Stagger that would normally go to you is actually going to go to him, so it redirects a little bit of that damage. So keep that in mind too if you're working on you know, building up your Stagger so that you can get a big Purifying Brew off so that you can then boost your Celestial Brew. You're likely not going to want to have Dave hanging out with you before you do that. You're probably going to want to go ahead and get that Purifying Brew off, get your Celestial Brew off so that you have a large Absorb Shield, and then bring Dave out there to help share the load in terms of all the mobs that need to be tanked. But this is a little bit different video than what I've done for some of the other tanks, and again, it was mainly because of the fact that Brewmaster saw a lot more changes than some of the other tanks. So just wanted to go ahead and review that with you guys. Let me know your comments below. Let me know if you have any questions. I've personally been maining a monk since Legion, and so this is a class that's very near and dear to my heart.